Hello, 75B. Welcome to your Week 13 overview. I apologize. I had thought I had made this already and posted it, but it completely got through my radar somehow. So hopefully it's not too late for you. We still got a lot of time. There's wiggle room still going on all over this course. So this week, we are going to be looking at Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. A really important and groundbreaking play. It also became a film. Keep in mind, the film is not a very accurate portrayal of the relationship between Stanley Kowalski and Blanche Dubois. No relation to W.E.B. Du Bois, even though they're spelled the same. What I want you to think about when you're looking at Streetcar is the way in which it's talking about how life has changed in the South, specifically New Orleans, after World War II. There are changes in representation of class and ethnicity and also gender. But there are also some holdovers. The idea of tradition, which affects some people positively, but affects some people, especially Blanche Dubois, very negatively. And if you want to go even further, I suggest you thinking about Blanche Dubois as a representation of the pre-Civil War South, especially white upper class Southern culture, with its emphasis on propriety and manners, but also secrecy and suppression. It's a really fascinating read. Different plays that have been videoed or put into film. Some of you are probably familiar with the Marlon Brando version that came out in, I believe, 1954. Again, gets some things right, but doesn't get everything right. Some of you are probably also familiar with the Simpsons episode called A Streetcar Named Marge. It's a great accessory to the play, but it's not the play itself. You really have to read the play to really understand what that episode is playing off of. Anyway, it's got a lot going on into it. And it's a fascinating read. And it, like I said, it does talk about the changing representation of gender and ethnicity and social class and even regionalism in the United States. So be on the lookout for those themes. Coming up for Saturday, you're going to be reading an excerpt from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. This is a mid-century text from an African-American writer, post-Harlem Renaissance, who in some ways is not doing what a lot of Harlem Renaissance writers would want him to do. He openly disavowed overtly political writing. So you're not going to see him come out and say, this is bad, this is good. Instead, he's writing a narrative, and in some ways, it's going to be fantastic. It's going to have a certain dreamlike quality with its imagery and with the actions that you see in it. You're going to be reading parts of it and think, whoa, did that really happen? That seems odd. That seems over the top. Take a note of that. But don't let that stop you from reading it. One of the ways that I like to think about Ralph Ellison is that expanded sense of reality and unconscious dripping through into texts that we see in earlier 20th century works and even late 19th century works. I'm thinking about Franz Kafka, for example, with the Metamorphosis. It's a fantastic example of that. You can also think of Dostoevsky's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. There's a sense of unreality, things that don't make sense in our physical waking world, but in a dream sense, there's an emotional or symbolic significance that resonates within us. So keep out on the lookout for that. If you've also read Nikolai Gogol, 19th century Russian writer, The Nose, for example, or The Overcoat, you've got a similar sense of uh, enhanced reality, what we sometimes call magical realism in Latinx American texts later on. We see some of that kind of embellishment going on too. Um, they're not quite the same thing, but there's an over the top sense in the imagery and in the actions that I think is going to come really apparent. I want you to think about the role of race in The Invisible Man. I also want you to think about the role of white American culture, including corporations. I also want you to think about the role of education, but also gender and sexuality. There's a very shocking scene when our young protagonist has to give a speech in front of the elders of the town that just goes completely bananas, haywire. Um, it's mortifying, but it's hard to look away at the same time. Uh, anyway, it's a fairly long book. We've only got a tiny excerpt about this. I've already told you how I feel about excerpts, but it's still worth it. I was going to say one more thing about it. Also think about generational representations of racism. There's actually a dream that our protagonist has in the end, towards the end of this excerpt. Um, and it's very, very telling. Now, we can infer all kinds of different positions that this text is making about racism, about sexism, about classism. Um, but he never comes out and says that. And, Ellison really um, pushed back against arguments that he was making any kind of statements. He says, I'm just writing a story. Um, and here's a good point to reinforce the notion that what the author's intention was, it can be nice to know, but it is not the beginning, nor is it the end of analysis and interpretation of that text. Otherwise, we'd be totally stuck. Oh, well, the author said that's not what he meant, so I guess we can't talk about that. No. I mean, this goes back to the idea of psychoanalytic criticism. Keep in mind that, according to this theory, every human being has these ideas that may not be socially acceptable, that might not even be fully understood by that person, that bubble up from time to time in their writing, in their thinking, in their actions, in their speaking. So if you look at it that way, there are a lot of interesting ideas coming up. And again, whether or not Ralph Ellison intended anything, or if any author intended anything, is really irrelevant. That's a kind of criticism that's way gone in the past. And it's more important to think about readings and other cultural artifacts like movies as an intersection of social forces, that in some way contribute to an artist or a writer's ideas, belief systems, etc., often without them consciously knowing it. Did I go on for a long time? I think I did. But anyway, two really fantastic texts going on here. You can definitely put Tennessee Williams, one of the most wonderful playwrights of the mid-20th century, into that Southern Gothic genre or literary movement. Now, looking at our discussion for this week, I'm asking you to think about Theodore Roethke and Elizabeth Bishop and their relationship between confessional domestic poets. Remember, that's all about how their relationships between family members or loved ones work and or don't work. This was kind of a taboo subject in poetry beforehand, but it's coming forward in the mid-20th century, partially because psychoanalysis as a way of understanding yourself is also coming to the forefront. You know, once upon a time, it was shameful to talk about any of those things in public. Maybe even with the people that are closest to in your lives. You just didn't say anything. There was no point. Um, Modern psychology tells us differently, that it's important to talk about the challenges that you might be facing in family relationships or interpersonal or romantic relationships. And these people, Reski and Bishop, are really pioneers in this field. Um, and you're going to find a tension between love and hate in some of these poems. You're going to find a tension between disgust and affection in these poems too, like we do with the people that are close to us. You know, people that we adore, that we would take a bullet for. We sometimes are like, oh, why did you do that? Why did you say that? Oh. We're all in that gray area in the middle sometimes. 100% love and 100% hate really doesn't exist in those relationships. And for Tennessee Williams, I am asking you to think about social and cultural changes in the post-World War II South. And I've talked about this a little bit already. Also think about Blanche Dubois coming from this lovely estate, and then how she left that estate and what has happened to her since then. So it's very interesting. In some ways, it harkens towards an elegiac piece of literature, an elegy. In other words, it's mourning something that is dead and past. But remember that the whole idea of the genteel South with its manners and its grand cotillions and balls and all that, it was all based on a fantasy. And the fantasy was that African Americans were not people. It was based on that labor. That's what made those fantasies possible and allowed them to propagate. So that's a lot going on in there. But again, two very interesting texts going on. Coming up finally, you do have a rough draft submission. Please know that it's coming up on this Sunday. I don't like giving double due dates for anything in this class, so keep that in mind. Love it or hate it, turn it in. Get feedback on it. Sunlight helps make the paper better. You know, if you want to, at the very beginning, you can start with that preamble that is almost universal in peer review, is that you say to your peer, sorry that this rough draft sucks. I mean, it's supposed to suck. It's a rough draft. And that's totally okay. You know, we're all here to help each other out and help refine each other. You don't have to beat somebody out in order to get a good grade in this class. So keep that in mind. I've also got some requests, some questions about your first papers. They are trickling in little by little. Check, turn it in first for the scores, but they will be added to Canvas as well. Do keep in mind, I have a policy of revision for both papers. So if you feel like you didn't get the grade that you would really like, or that you really want to get better at writing these kinds of papers, come talk to me. Zoom with me. I'll be happy to discuss a rewrite with each and every one of you. That's always been my policy. Of course, to be fair, you do have to make sure that you're keeping up on all the work in order to know all these things. If you're not watching the videos that I'm making right now, do keep in mind, if you're not watching them regularly, do keep in mind that they are a requirement of the course, and all the work that you do and your grade is based on the assumption that you are doing the viewing. That being said, if there's any way I can juice them up, make them more interesting, that's fine. Try to keep them right to the point so that you can jump into the work. If you've got any advice of how to make the videos better, or any advice at all about the course, I'd love to hear it. Until then, I hope you're having a great week, and I will talk to you soon.